In the dead of winter, in the remote town of Glenfield, a record-breaking blizzard struck. The snowstorm was so fierce that visibility dropped to near zero. Roads were buried, power lines snapped, and the townsfolk huddled indoors. Except for three friends, Mark, Rachel, and Chris, who decided to brave the storm to check on a missing co-worker, Lauren. She hadn't returned from a mountain lodge retreat, and the storm had cut all communication. The trio drove a sturdy 4x4 truck up the winding mountain road. The blizzard was merciless, slamming the windshield with icy shards. The GPS flickered, struggling to keep track of their location. Their only guide was a hand-drawn map Lauren had shared weeks ago. "Maybe she stayed at the lodge. She's probably safe," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "Then why hasn't she called? Something's wrong," Mark replied grimly. Chris, the quietest of the three, gripped the steering wheel. "We'll find her." As they ascended, the road disappeared under a blanket of snow, forcing them to stop. The lodge was a 30-minute hike through the forest, but the storm made it treacherous. Still, they bundled up, grabbed flashlights, and set off. The woods were eerily silent, except for the howling wind. As they trudged through knee-deep snow, Rachel suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Mark and Chris stopped. Faintly, through the wind, came the sound of laughter. High-pitched and unnatural, it echoed like a child playing in the distance. But there was no one else around. "It's just the wind," Chris said, though his voice lacked conviction. The sound grew louder, circling them, until it stopped abruptly. The trio exchanged uneasy glances and pressed on. After what felt like hours, they saw the lodge emerge through the swirling snow. It was dark and desolate, its windows frosted over. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a dim interior. "Lauren," Mark called out, his voice echoing. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and old wood. Their flashlights illuminated overturned furniture and scattered belongings. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. Chris found a notebook on the table. It was Lauren's. Inside, she had scribbled frantic notes. "Something's outside. I keep hearing whispers. They won't let me leave." "What does she mean, they?" Rachel asked, her voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, there was a loud bang from upstairs. The trio raced up the creaky staircase. At the end of the hall, a door swung open and shut violently in the wind. Inside, they found a broken window, snow blowing in. "Did she jump?" Mark muttered, peering out into the white abyss. "Guys," Rachel whispered, pointing at the floor. In the center of the room, etched into the wooden boards, was a symbol, a crude circle with jagged lines crossing through it. Surrounding it were scattered footprints as if someone had been pacing. Mark leaned closer. "What the hell is—" Suddenly, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The flashlights flickered and the temperature dropped sharply. Then faint whispers began filling the room. They were indistinct at first, but soon became a chorus of voices, pleading, laughing, and screaming all at once. Panicking, Chris forced the door open and they bolted downstairs. But the lodge seemed different, endless hallways where there should have been walls, doors leading to nowhere. Rachel screamed, "They're following us!" Mark turned his flashlight back and froze. Shadows, twisted human-like figures, moved just beyond the light's reach, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces obscured. "This way!" Chris yelled, leading them toward the main door. When they burst outside, the storm had intensified. The lodge vanished behind a wall of snow. They had no choice but to keep moving, but every step felt wrong, like the forest was shifting around them. After hours of wandering, they stumbled upon a cabin, a smaller, older structure they hadn't seen before. Desperate for shelter, they went inside. It was a single room, with a fireplace, though the fire was dead. On the table was a photograph. It showed Lauren, smiling with a group of strangers. But the date on the back was from 30 years ago. Rachel gasped. "This doesn't make sense." The door slammed shut behind them. A voice, faint and feminine, echoed through the cabin. "You shouldn't have come." The shadows reappeared, this time surrounding them completely. As their flashlights died, the only thing left was the sound of the storm and the laughter. The next day, the blizzard subsided, and search teams found the 4x4 truck abandoned on the mountain road. No sign of Mark, Rachel, Chris, or Lauren was ever discovered. But locals say that on stormy nights, if you venture too close to the lodge, you can hear whispers in the wind, and sometimes a woman's voice begging for help. It was December 12th, 1998, when a devastating blizzard swallowed the tiny town of Black Hollow, Wyoming. The snowstorm, nicknamed the White Demon by locals, was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Amidst the chaos, the Carter family, Tom, his wife Linda, and their teenage daughter Emily, were driving home from a Christmas visit to Tom's parents in a nearby town. They never made it back. The story of what happened to them became one of Black Hollow's darkest mysteries. The Carters left late, despite warnings of worsening weather. The drive should have taken only an hour, but as the snow piled up and the wind howled, the route became treacherous. Tom gripped the wheel, his knuckles white as the snow erased the road ahead. "We should have stayed at your parents'," Linda muttered nervously. "We'll be fine," Tom reassured her, though doubt gnawed at him. In the back seat, Emily, 16, was glued to her Walkman, oblivious to the tension. Suddenly, the car jerked violently, skidding on the icy road. Tom fought to regain control, but the tires slid into a ditch. The engine sputtered and died. "Great," Linda muttered. Tom sighed. "I'll check it out. Stay here." He stepped out, disappearing into the swirling snow. Linda and Emily waited, shivering as the cold seeped into the car. 5 minutes passed, then 10. "Dad's taking too long," Emily said, worry creeping into her voice. Linda grabbed a flashlight and stepped out, calling Tom's name. But there was no sign of him, just the endless, blinding snow. Panic set in as Linda returned to the car. "Emily, stay here. I'm going to look for him." Emily protested, but Linda was firm. She grabbed a scarf and the flashlight, vanishing into the storm. Minutes turned into an hour. Neither parent returned. Emily sat alone in the car, her breath fogging up the windows. The wind outside sounded almost human, low and mournful, like someone calling her name. Then came the knock. A soft, deliberate tapping on the driver's side window. Emily whipped her head around, expecting to see her dad. Instead, a shadowy figure stood just beyond the frosted glass. "Mom? Dad?" she called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, unmoving. Heart pounding, Emily mustered her courage and cracked the window. "Who are you? Do you need help?" The figure leaned closer, and Emily recoiled. Its face was pale and sunken, with hollow black eyes. It smiled, a wide, unnatural grin. "Your parents are waiting," it whispered in a raspy voice. Emily screamed, slamming the window shut and locking the doors. When she looked again, The figure was gone. Terrified, Emily realized she couldn't stay in the car. It was freezing, and the fuel gauge read empty. She grabbed her coat and flashlight, deciding to follow her parents' footprints in the snow. The storm was relentless, the wind biting at her exposed skin. The footprints led into the woods, winding through dense trees until she spotted a faint glow ahead. It was a cabin, its windows lit by flickering lanterns. Emily's relief was short-lived. As she approached, she noticed strange symbols carved into the wooden door, circles, spirals, and jagged lines. They looked ancient, almost tribal. Still, she knocked. "Mom? Dad?" The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the cabin was warm but eerily quiet. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. On the table was an old radio, crackling with static. "Hello?" Emily called, stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind her, making her jump. She spun around, but no one was there. Then she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Her parents' coats were hanging by the door, still damp from the snow. "Mom? Dad?" Emily's voice was shaky now. She moved deeper into the cabin, finding a staircase that led to the basement. A faint sound, whispers, faint and garbled, drifted up from below. Against her better judgment, Emily descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, she found a stone room lit by a single lantern. In the center was a circle of salt, and within it, her parents knelt, motionless. "Mom! Dad!" Emily rushed to them, but they didn't respond. Their eyes were open, staring blankly ahead. A voice echoed from the shadows. "They can't hear you." Emily spun around, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The figure from the car stood there, grinning. "What do you want?" Emily demanded. The figure tilted its head. "You've been chosen. The storm brought you to us." "What are you talking about? Let them go." The figure stepped closer, its body distorting, limbs stretching unnaturally. "They're already gone, but you can take their place." Emily's flashlight flickered, plunging the room into near darkness. She felt a cold hand grip her shoulder and screamed. The lantern's light surged, revealing more figures, pale, hollow-eyed, and grinning. They surrounded the salt circle, chanting in a language Emily didn't recognize. The figure spoke again. "The storm demands a sacrifice. One must stay, so the others can leave." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, take me instead." The chanting grew louder. The circle of salt glowed faintly, and her parents began to stir, their movements jerky and unnatural. "No, stop," Emily screamed, throwing herself into the circle. The figures paused, their heads tilting in unison. Then, as if satisfied, they began to fade, one by one, into the shadows. Her parents gasped, collapsing to the floor. The lantern's light dimmed, and the cabin fell silent. Emily helped her parents upstairs and out into the snow. The storm had calmed, and they could see the faint outline of the road ahead. But as they trudged back to the car, Emily noticed something unsettling. The footprints they left behind weren't theirs. They were long and skeletal, like those of the figures in the cabin. When they reached the car, it was untouched, as if they'd never left. "We're safe now," Tom said, starting the engine. But as they drove off, Emily glanced back at the woods. The cabin was gone. Later, when the Carters recounted their story to the townsfolk, no one believed them. But Emily knew the truth. Every winter, when the blizzard howled, she could still hear the whispers calling her name. In January 2006, a freak blizzard swept through the small mountain town of Elk Ridge, Colorado. Among the many stories of stranded motorists and frostbitten hikers, one story stood out, a disappearance that baffled search teams and haunted the locals for years. It began with 4 friends, Jason, Claire, Ben, and Sophie, on a weekend trip to a remote ski lodge. They planned to escape the hustle of the city and enjoy the serenity of the snowy wilderness. Instead, they uncovered something that should have stayed buried in the frost. The friends arrived at the lodge late on Friday night, just as the first flurries of snow began to fall. The cabin was rustic but cozy, perched on the edge of a dense forest. "This place is perfect," Claire said, setting her bag down. Jason, ever the practical one, checked the weather forecast. "Blizzard warning for tomorrow. Looks like we'll be snowed in." "Good thing we stocked up on food and firewood," Ben said with a grin. The group spent the first evening relaxing by the fire, sharing stories and sipping hot cocoa. Sophie, an avid reader, found an old journal tucked in a drawer and began flipping through its brittle pages. "Looks like someone kept a diary here," she said. "Anything juicy?" Jason joked. Sophie read aloud. January 1978. "The voices started again last night. I thought the snow would drown them out, but they're louder now, closer." The room fell silent. "Creepy," Ben said with a nervous chuckle. "Probably just a prank," Jason added. But Sophie kept reading. The entries grew more frantic, detailing strange noises, shadows in the trees, and a feeling of being watched. The final entry read, January 15th, 1978. "If anyone finds this, don't go into the woods. There's something out there that doesn't want us to leave." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but they laughed it off. By midnight, the snow was falling heavily, and the wind howled like a living thing. The next morning, the cabin was completely snowed in. The doors were blocked by drifts, and the windows were frosted over. Jason and Ben shoveled a path outside, but as soon as they stepped into the clearing, they stopped cold. "Are those footprints?" Ben whispered. Leading from the forest to the cabin was a trail of deep, uneven prints, as if someone, or something, had walked right up to their door during the night. "Probably just an animal," Jason said, though his voice betrayed his doubt. When they returned to the cabin, Claire and Sophie were already on edge. "There were noises last night," Claire said. "I thought it was the wind, but it sounded like footsteps." Jason dismissed it, but the group decided to stay indoors, lighting a fire to keep warm. As the hours passed, the tension grew. Sophie kept glancing at the windows, certain she saw movement in the trees. Then came the first knock. It was faint at first, a gentle tap on the window. The friends froze. Jason grabbed a flashlight and shone it outside, but the snow reflected the beam, making it impossible to see anything. "Who's out there?" he called. No response. Moments later, the knocking moved to the front door, louder this time, insistent. Jason opened the door a crack, but the blizzard had erased everything in white. There was no one there. "We need to stay calm," Jason said, shutting the door. That night, the group huddled by the fire, taking turns keeping watch. Around 3 a.m., Claire, who was on shift, heard whispering. It was faint, almost like a breeze, but she swore she could make out words. "Come outside. We're waiting." She woke the others, her voice shaking. "I heard something. Voices." "Maybe it's someone lost in the storm," Ben suggested. Jason grabbed his coat. "I'll check it out." The others protested, but he insisted. Jason stepped into the blizzard, his flashlight barely cutting through the snow. He called out, but the wind swallowed his voice. Then, just beyond the trees, he saw a figure, a man in old, tattered clothing standing perfectly still. "Hey, do you need help?" Jason shouted. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked deeper into the forest. Against his better judgment, Jason followed. Back at the cabin, the others waited anxiously. Minutes turned into an hour, and Jason didn't return. "We have to find him," Sophie said. "No," Claire insisted. "We should wait. He might come back." But when another knock came, this time on the back door, they all screamed. Ben mustered his courage and opened the back door. The footprints leading away were Jason's, fresh and clear, heading straight into the woods. "That doesn't make sense," Sophie whispered. "He left from the front." The group decided to follow the tracks, bundling up and stepping into the storm. The trail led them deeper into the forest, where the trees grew twisted and gnarled. Sophie shone her flashlight on a low branch and screamed. Hanging from it was Jason's scarf, torn and bloodied. "What happened to him?" Claire whispered. Before anyone could answer, the whispers returned, louder now, circling them. "Who's there?" Ben shouted. The only reply was a chorus of eerie laughter. Panicking, the friends ran back towards the cabin, but when they reached the clearing, it was gone. The snow had erased all signs of it, leaving only an expanse of white. "This isn't possible," Sophie said, tears streaming down her face. They stumbled through the snow, disoriented, until they saw a light flickering in the distance. Desperate, they followed it, hoping to find help. Instead, they found an old church, half buried in snow. Inside, candles burned on an altar, and the walls were covered in symbols, the same ones from the diary. At the center of the room lay Jason, unconscious but alive. "Jason!" Claire cried, running to him. But as she shook him awake, his eyes opened, and they were completely black. He smiled, his voice a rasp. "You shouldn't have come." The candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers returned, now deafening. The door slammed shut, and the last thing the friends saw was a dozen shadowy figures closing in. Days later, a rescue team found the cabin, abandoned. Inside, they discovered the diary on the table, open to a new entry written in shaky handwriting. "They took us. Don't let the storm bring you here." The friends were never seen again, but on stormy nights hikers report seeing lights in the woods and hearing faint whispers in the wind.